The velvet is the first thing I notice, soft, faintly cool, wrapped in a handkerchief that smells of cedar, buried at the bottom of a shoebox marked keep. My thumb finds an edge too square to be nothing, and before my mind catches up, something in my chest already knows. Whatever this is, it isn't mine to find. Diane's ring is 2 floors below me right now, on her hand, in the kitchen, laughing with her mother over seating charts, the ring I bought outside Duran the week before I came home. So when the box inside the handkerchief turns out to be the wrong color, a deep maroon instead of the pale blue I know by heart, I go still. The hinge is stiff. I work it open anyway. There's no ring inside, just a single fold of paper, soft at the creases, for words inked across the top in handwriting I'd know in the dark. I read the first line. I do not let myself read the second. Below me, Diane is still laughing about something, an ordinary sound that has no business sharing a house with what's sitting open in my palm. To understand why a 4-inch box could put a grown man's hands so still, you would have to go back further than any of this, back to a county fair in Hollis Creek in the summer of 1985, to a ring toss booth where I spent $1 in nickels trying to win Diane a plastic prize shaped like a rose and missed every throw, and she laughed at me so hard she had to sit down on a hay bale to finish laughing, and I decided right there, 19 years old and 2 years into an Army enlistment I'd signed, mostly to get out of Hollis Creek, that I wasn't going to mind getting roped back into it after all. I was already a soldier when we met, which meant our whole courtship ran on the Army's clock and not ours. And looking back now, I can name the cost of that in specific days the way another man might name his children. In June of 1986, I was standing in a barracks in Bamberg, West Germany, 11 months into a year-long, unaccompanied tour, picturing rather than watching Diane walk across a gymnasium stage in a blue cap and gown, because her letter that month described the gym so carefully, the crepe paper, the folding chairs, her father's whistle audible over the applause, that I think she knew I'd need the details to build the day myself, since I couldn't be in it. That whole year, a phone call home cost more than I made in a week and ran through a relay operator who said over to keep the line moving. So mostly we wrote, and I marked off the days on a paper calendar tacked above my bunk with a red pen that went dry twice before that tour was finished. In March of 1988, I was 11 miles into a field training exercise at Fort Stewart when word came that Diane's grandmother had died. And by the time my company commander cut the paperwork for emergency leave and I'd hitched 2 flights and a 6-hour drive, I arrived at the cemetery a full day after the funeral, in time to see only the fresh-turned dirt and a few folding chairs still standing in rows where the mourners had sat. No one left to tell me which chair had been Diane's. In July of 1989, I was at Fort Benning for an 8-week leadership course when Diane's older sister got married, and Diane stood up as maid of honor and danced the unmarried sister's mirror of the father-daughter dance alone, with her own father, in a spot the seating chart had clearly left open for someone else. That same fall, she signed the lease on her first apartment by herself, on a Tuesday afternoon with nobody beside her but the landlord, because I was in the field again and couldn't get a weekend pass, and she told me about it in a letter so cheerful I didn't understand until years later how much that cheerfulness had cost her to manufacture. And on the last night of 1989, I was pulling staff duty in a near-empty orderly room while Diane watched the ball drop on a black and white television at a friend's apartment. And when I finally got her on the phone past midnight, the line crackled with a half-second satellite delay that made every sentence land a beat behind itself, so that even wishing her a happy new year felt like something I was doing to her instead of with her. None of this, at the time, struck either of us as a choice anyone was making. It was simply the Army, the way weather is simply weather, something that happened to people who loved soldiers, not something a soldier did to the people who loved him. I told myself that for years before I had any reason to wonder if it was true. By the summer of 1990, I'd made sergeant and Diane had 2 years steady at the diner and a hope chest in her closet that her mother kept adding to faster than either of us added to our plans. And I want to say we were drifting toward a wedding the way couples are supposed to. Except the truth is we were waiting on nothing in particular, the way people wait when the Army hasn't yet told them what they're waiting for. Then on the 2nd of August, Iraq crossed into Kuwait, and within a week my unit had orders, and the particular thing we'd been waiting for turned out to be this. I proposed to Diane on the porch of her parents' house the night before I shipped to Saudi Arabia, with a ring I'd bought in a hurry from a jeweler 2 counties over, and a speech I hadn't planned at all, just 4 sentences that amounted to "marry me when I get back," because I couldn't stand the idea of leaving anything between us open-ended. She said yes before I'd even finished the second sentence. Her porch light had a moth circling it the whole time, and I remember thinking, with the particular arrogance of a 24-year-old who has never yet lost anything that mattered, that the hardest part was already behind us. The hardest part, it turned out, was a desert that didn't care what either of us thought we knew. Mail call in Saudi Arabia ran like church, same time, same low ritual hush before the sergeant started calling names. And for the first 10 weeks of Desert Shield, Diane's letters came like clockwork, 2 or 3 a week, smelling faintly of the lavender drawer liner her mother used, each one numbered in the corner, so I'd know if any got lost in the system. Then, in the back half of November, the letters stopped. Not all at once. They thinned first, 1 a week, then 1 in 10 days, then a stretch of 17 days with nothing, which I know because I counted, standing in that mail call line each evening with my hands in my pockets like a man trying not to look like he's counting. A buddy of mine, Russ Calder, who'd gotten 3 letters that week to my 0, leaned over on day 14 and said, not unkindly, "Hometown getting cold feet on you, Mercer," and laughed the way men laugh when they're as scared as you are and don't have a better way to say it. I didn't laugh. I walked out past the motor pool instead, past rows of Humvees with their hoods up and mechanics half swallowed by their engines, the diesel smell so thick it coated the back of my throat, and I stood there long enough to watch the sun go down red through the haze the way it did every evening in that country, like the whole sky was rusting. A string of distant artillery fire popped somewhere to the west while I stood there, far enough off that nobody else even turned their head toward it. And I remember being grateful for the noise simply because it was something to listen to besides my own thinking. I told myself it was the postal system. I told myself it was always the postal system, that mail moved through 3 different countries before it found a soldier, that 17 days was nothing compared to some men who hadn't gotten a single letter in a month. I told myself this standing in sand that had already worked its way into my boots no matter how many times I emptied them, and I made myself believe it long enough to walk back to my tent and write Diane another letter as though nothing about the silence on her end had changed anything about what I felt on mine. 3 days later, the letters started again, just as steady as before, no explanation offered and none asked for. And I let myself exhale and call it the postal system after all, because the alternative wasn't a thought I had room for in a place where I needed every spare thought for staying alive. The ground war lasted 4 days. We were home by April, married in our minds if not yet on paper, with a wedding set for the 2nd Saturday of September so Diane could have the kind of long engagement her mother always said a girl deserved after a war. Which brings us back to that shoebox-marked keep, on a Tuesday in August with 5 weeks left before the wedding, and a maroon box that wasn't mine sitting open in my hand. The first thing I understood, standing there, had nothing to do with rings. It had to do with 17 days in November I'd spent telling myself was the postal system. I understood, all at once and without anyone confirming it, that the gap in Diane's letters hadn't been a failure of any postal system at all, that somewhere in that stretch of silence, she had made a decision, privately, deliberately, the kind of decision a person makes alone in a room with the door shut, and that whatever this box had once held was the shape of that decision. I sat down on the edge of her childhood bed, which creaked under me the way it must have creaked under 100 nights of a girl doing exactly that, sitting, deciding, alone, and I understood that her silence in November hadn't been an accident I'd simply outlasted. It had been a choice, and the not telling me afterward had been a choice too, one she'd kept making every single day since, including the day she put my actual ring back on her hand and let me believe nothing in our story had so much as paused. I folded the handkerchief back over the box the way I'd found it. Then I didn't move for a while, just sat in a child's bedroom gone half empty with packing, looking at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like Florida that Diane had pointed out to me 100 times over the years, and I have never been able to explain, to myself or to anyone, why the next thing my mind went to wasn't her face, or the name of the man I didn't even have yet, but a stretch of road outside a town called Kafji that I hadn't let myself think about in 5 months. It was my sister, Carol, who gave the situation its name a few days later, entirely by accident, while pinning a corsage to a chair back for the rehearsal dinner seating. She said something about how relieved she was that Diane had come to her senses, and when I asked what she meant, she went very still, the pin held between 2 fingers, and said, "I just figured you already knew about Gary Pruitt. Everybody in town knew, Walt." It didn't even last a month. I told her I did know, because some instinct in me decided right then that I would rather lie to my own sister than let anyone in Hollis Creek learn I'd found out the way I had, alone, in a shoebox, days before my own wedding. Carol seemed satisfied with that and went back to her corsage. I went and stood on the back porch for a while, looking at nothing in particular, turning the name Gary Pruitt over like a stone I'd picked up without meaning to, recognizing it now. The Pruitts ran the feed store 2 blocks from the diner, and Gary had been 2 years ahead of me in school. A perfectly ordinary man I had nodded to my whole life, without once considering him a threat to anything. What it did instead, that name, was send me back to a stretch of road outside Kofji that I hadn't let myself think about in 5 months. In late January, near the start of the ground push, my platoon had 2 scout vehicles running parallel routes a half-mile apart, and the assignment to either one came down to nothing more meaningful than a coin Daryl Whitfield flipped outside the motor pool the night before. Heads, his vehicle took the north route. Tails, mine did. It came up heads. Whit's vehicle hit a mine 11 hours later. I felt the percussion of it through the ground before the radio even crackled with the report, a sensation less like sound and more like the earth clearing its throat. And afterward there was a stretch of maybe 90 minutes where nobody would say his name on the radio at all, just designations and grid coordinates, as if naming him out loud might make the thing more true than it already was. Whit was 23. He was from a town 40 minutes from Hollis Creek, close enough that our mothers had met twice at a regional fair, close enough that I'd written to him about Diane more than I'd written to almost anyone else over there, because he was the one man in that desert who already understood what Hollis Creek looked like in October. I have not said his name out loud in the 5 months since, not once, not even to Diane, because saying it has always felt like handing someone a live wire. Standing on that back porch with Gary Pruitt's name freshly turned over in my mind, I understood, in a way I couldn't yet put into words, that Whit's death was the reason this discovery had taken the shape it did inside my chest, not jealousy. Exactly, though there was some of that too, but something closer to the recognition that the war had very nearly made Diane a widow to a man she hadn't married yet, and that some bone-deep, animal part of her might have started grieving me a few months early, the way you might start mourning a house you can already smell is on fire. I went inside and washed my hands at the kitchen sink for longer than washing them required, watching the water run clear long after my hands already were, because it was easier than going back upstairs, and because my mother always said a man could think more clearly with his hands busy than with them still, though I'm not sure either of us ever tested whether that was actually true. Outside the window over the sink, a neighbor's sprinkler ticked back and forth across a lawn that didn't need it, the most ordinary sound in the world. It would be nearly 2 years before the second piece of this fell into place. On a Sunday afternoon, I drove the 40 minutes to deliver a box of Whit's personal effects to his mother, Eleanor Whitfield, a duty the Army had quietly assigned to whichever surviving buddy lived closest, and which I'd put off twice already because I didn't trust myself to sit in that woman's kitchen without falling apart. She made coffee I didn't really want, and we went through the box together at her table, letters, a wristwatch, a deck of cards held together with a rubber band. And at some point, holding one of his letters without reading it, she said, mostly to herself, I used to tell him, find a girl and marry her quick, don't wait on anything. Look where waiting got us. And her voice didn't break exactly. It just went very flat and quiet, the way a held breath sounds right before it's let out. I had Diane's maroon box folded up small enough in the back of my mind by then that it would have taken nothing. One sentence. You know, Eleanor, it nearly happened to me too. My girl nearly didn't wait either to turn that kitchen into the first place I ever said any of it out loud. I got as far as opening my mouth. What came out instead was something about how Whit used to talk about Diane's pie, which was true, and made Eleanor laugh for the first time that visit. And I drove the 40 minutes home telling myself I'd done the kind thing, the right thing, without examining too closely why the kind thing and the silent thing kept turning out to be the exact same thing every single time I was offered the choice. That has turned out to be the actual shape of it. Looking back from this distance, not one secret kept once, but the same secret kept available, over and over, every time an opening presented itself, for the better part of 34 years now. I have told the story of marrying Diane Holloway probably 1,000 times since, at reunions and anniversaries, and to our own children when they asked how their parents met, and it is always the same story, county fair, ring toss, the war, the wedding 5 weeks after I got home, and it is always true, every word of it, and it has never once been the whole of what happened. What I have never told anyone including the woman I have shared a bed with for 34 years, is that I never wanted her tested like that again. Not by another deployment, not by another 17-day silence, not by anything. I have spent decades quietly grateful every time the Army moved us to a posting that didn't separate us. Every time a war started and ended without pulling me into it. Every time Gary Pruitt's name came up at some town function and I could nod along, easy, unbothered, the picture of a settled man, while privately keeping a kind of ledger nobody else knew existed, tallying every year that passed without anything coming along strong enough to test what 17 silent days in 1990 had already proven could bend. I have performed, for 34 years, the particular pride of a man who got the girl and never doubted it for a second. I have never once let that performance slip in front of Diane. Not even the year our own daughter left for her freshman year of college, and Diane cried in the truck the whole drive home, and I caught myself watching her, wondering for 1 second whether the tears were only about our daughter. I am not entirely sure, some nights, whether I kept it from her to protect her, or because some part of me needed the not knowing to stay exactly where it was, because a man who never asks the question never has to hear an answer he can't live with. I almost left it there, box rewrapped in its handkerchief, lid closed, conscience telling itself it had seen enough, when my thumb caught the corner of something else underneath where the box had been sitting, flat against the bottom of the shoebox. Easy to miss if you weren't already disturbing things you had no business disturbing. It was an envelope, addressed in handwriting I knew even better than Diane's, because it was my own. APO San Francisco return address. My service number printed below it the way the Army required. Postmarked the 11th of December, 1990, square in the middle of those 17 silent days, a letter I had written and mailed and, until this exact moment, assumed had simply been lost somewhere between 3 countries, the way I'd told myself everything else had been lost that month. The seal was unbroken. 5 years of envelopes opened by hand, by letter knife, by impatient thumbs tearing straight through the flap, had taught me exactly what an opened envelope looks like, and this wasn't one. Diane had received this letter. The postmark on her side, faint but legible, proved that much, and she had never opened it. I held it longer than I meant to, turning it over once, running my thumb along the sealed flap the way you'd touch a scar to confirm it's really there, working out whether 30 seconds of tearing paper would tell me something I needed to know 34 years sooner than I was about to learn it. I decided against it. Not out of any particular nobility. I want to be honest about that, even now, but because some part of me understood that an unopened letter from 1990 was the one piece of that whole afternoon I still had a choice about, and everything else I'd already lost the choice on the moment I'd opened that maroon box. I put the letter back exactly where I'd found it, underneath the handkerchief, underneath the box, in the exact order I'd disturbed it, and I went downstairs and told Diane's mother the shoebox marked keep was ready to load into the truck whenever she wanted it there, and my voice, when I said it, didn't shake at all, which surprised me more than almost anything else that day. The wedding was the second Saturday of September at the Hollis Creek Methodist Church, with the kind of late summer heat that made every man in a borrowed suit sweat through his shirt before the ceremony even started. I remember the organ more than I remember almost anything else from the service itself, a hymn Diane's grandmother had requested, played slightly too slow by an organist who was also, as it happened, Eleanor Whitfield's sister, which meant Whit's name sat somewhere in that sanctuary too, unspoken, the way it always would now. Diane came down the aisle on her father's arm in a dress with sleeves too heavy for the weather, and when she reached me, she was already laughing a little at something, nerves probably, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me, that I had never once, not for 1 second since reading that first line in her mother's spare bedroom, stopped wanting to marry her. That part, at least, the war in the box and everything in it had not managed to touch. During the toasts at the reception, held in the Pruitt family's own hay barn because the Pruitts owned the only barn in town big enough and lent it out for things like this. An irony I don't think anyone but me registered that day. Diane stood up with a glass of someone's father's homemade wine and said, looking right at me, that she'd never doubted us, not once, the whole time I was gone. And the room made the soft, appreciative sound a room makes when it believes exactly what it's hearing. I smiled. I did not correct her. I have never corrected her in 34 years, and I am not going to start in the telling of this either. Because the correction was never the point. The point was that I had a choice. Standing there with a glass of wine I wasn't really drinking, to either let her sentence stand as the whole truth or chip at it. And I chose, the way I have chosen every single time since, to let it stand. It was somewhere in the middle of that reception, between the toasts and the first dance, that I looked up from refilling a water glass I didn't need and found Gary Pruitt across the barn, leaning against a support post near the punch table, watching the room the way a man watches a room he isn't quite sure he's allowed to be standing in. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds. He gave me a small nod, not a challenge, not an apology, just an acknowledgement, the kind two men give each other when they both know something the rest of the room doesn't, and have already silently agreed it's going to stay that way. I nodded back. Neither of us moved toward the other. Diane's father called everyone's attention for the first dance about 30 seconds later, and I put down the water glass and went to find my wife. And that was the entire transaction between Gary Pruitt and me. 2 nods, 6 feet apart, in a barn his own family owned, and nothing else. Not that day, and not in any of the 34 years since. Not even the year he sat 2 rows behind us at his own mother's funeral, and I felt his eyes on the back of my neck the whole service, and never once turned around. The drive home that night, in a borrowed car decorated with shaving cream and tin cans by somebody's cousins, was quiet in the particular way 2 people can be quiet when they're both relieved a thing is finally over, though I suspect we were each relieved about a different thing. Diane fell half asleep against the window somewhere past the county line, and at a stop sign with nobody else on the road. I asked her, mostly to have something to say, happy? She didn't open her eyes. Yes, she said, just that, soft and certain, and I drove the rest of the way home deciding that one word was true enough to build a marriage on, even if it wasn't the whole shape of everything underneath it. 3 days later, unpacking wedding gifts into the small rented house on Birch Street that would be ours for the next 2 years, I watched Diane carry that same shoebox marked Keep In from her parents' truck and set it, without ceremony, into the bottom drawer of a dresser her uncle had built us as a wedding gift. The same shoebox, the same handkerchief, the same maroon box, and unopened letter folded inside it, carried whole and unexamined into the first house of our marriage, the way a person carries a stone they've decided not to put down. I didn't say anything. I held the dresser steady while she leveled its feet against the uneven floor, and then I went to hang a picture in the hallway. And that was, as far as either of us has ever said out loud, the end of it. 34 years is a long time to share a house with a drawer you've decided not to open, and I want to say I forgot about it somewhere in there. The way you forget about most things you've made peace with, but that wouldn't be true. I thought about it on every anniversary. I thought about it the 2 times Gary Pruitt's name came up in casual conversation at the feed store, still alive, still in town, married now himself to a woman from 2 counties over. I thought about it, oddly, every time one of our own children left for something, college, basic training, their own weddings, because Diane and I would stand in some doorway watching them go. And I understood by then, in a way I hadn't at 24, that every goodbye carries the seed of every other goodbye a person has ever survived. 3 years ago, downsizing out of the house on Maple where we raised both our kids and into the smaller place we live in now, I was the one who emptied that same dresser for moves and 4 decades old, still standing, because Diane had a hip that didn't love bending into low drawers anymore, and I told her I'd handle it, and she let me. The way she's let me handle plenty of things over the years without either of us examining why I always volunteer for that particular drawer specifically. The shoebox was still there. The handkerchief had thinned with age until it was barely more than a suggestion of cloth. The maroon box was exactly where I'd left it 30-some years before. Its velvet gone soft at the corners now, worn down to something closer to skin than fabric, the way velvet goes when nobody has handled it in a very long time, or when somebody has handled it more than they'd ever admit. I didn't open it. I already know what's inside, and I have never read past the first line. And at this point in a marriage, I don't know what I'd be looking for that 34 years hasn't already answered in every way that matters except the one direct way neither of us has ever risked. The letter beside it is still sealed. I packed both of them, along with the handkerchief, into a moving box marked, in my own handwriting this time, Keep, and I carried it into our new house myself, and I set it in the bottom drawer of whatever dresser was nearest, and I have not told Diane I know, and at this point I suspect I never will, and some nights that feels like the kindest thing I've ever done for her. And other nights it feels like the one cowardice I never managed to ship overseas and leave behind. Either way, the box is still there. The velvet is still soft. And as far as I know, neither of us has ever said a word.